Welcome to this discussion of going beyond the concept of the 15-minute city, hosted by Schindler. I'm Amy Gutman. I've been an international journalist for the past 20 years, and most recently hosted Schindler's podcast about urban areas called Perspectives in Motion. I've covered current affairs, business, architecture, and design for outlets such as PBS NewsHour, the BBC, Forbes, and many others. Thank you for joining us. We're speaking with two experts about the 15-minute city and beyond. To set the scene, we'll speak with architect and engineer Professor Carlo Ratti, who teaches at MIT and directs their Sensible City Lab. Carlo co-founded his own international design and innovation firm, and Wired magazine has named him one of the 50 people who will change the world. Following that conversation, we'll speak with Eric Iverson, a transportation expert and interim director of sustainability and resilience for the city of Tempe, Arizona, which developed a 20-minute city. First, welcome, Carlo.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Let's begin with the premise of the 15-minute city concept. It's not something that's new anymore, yet not everybody's familiar with it. So what is the basic idea or principle behind this?
Yeah, well, the basic principle is easily said. By the way, the 15-minute city was developed by Carlos Moreno, a professor at La Sorbonne in Paris, and also the team behind Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris. And the idea, as I said, is quite simple. Is imagine we could develop a city where every district, every neighborhood is a place where you can find most of the things you need in your daily life within a 15-minute walk or bike ride. And, the concept was developed initially during the pandemic, and clearly during the pandemic, all of us, we wish everything we needed in our everyday lives was just a 15-minute walk or bike ride away from us.
There are some that stipulate that while it's a wonderful idea and a wonderful ideal, cities by their very nature need to be dynamic places, and that what gives a city its personality are the interactions, sometimes very random, that occur when different people mix, when you have diverse interactions and engagement of people crossing the city, of people actually leaving their neighborhoods. Others have said that a city of fragmented neighborhoods just isn't the same. I think of Los Angeles, which many have called a city of suburbs, in fact. So how do you integrate the ideals of a dynamic city while also maintaining this concept?
Yeah. Well, first, let's look at the positive of the 15-minute city. I think there's other positives. Certainly, one is we can spend less time commuting. The second thing is actually we can move less with a car, we can walk, we can bike to many places. And the third one is also in terms of community. We know better people in our neighborhood, and that becomes, a city then becomes like a fractal organism where every unit is something that's replicated at different scales. And so where the city becomes an organism made of smaller components. So I would say there's many positives, but you're absolutely right. Quite a few people, including Ed Glazer or Pierre Veltz, have highlighted a possible risk. And if you want, one way to say it is, think about it. We always had 15-minute cities. Well, there were villages. And we know that village doesn't offer the same opportunities of a big city. Precisely the encounters you were mentioning before happen in a different way in a small village versus a big metropolis. And so the thing we need to pay attention to is how can we make sure we create livable neighborhoods, but at the same time, we keep the economies of scale and the excitement that come with the city as a whole. And that's really the big challenge in implementing 15-minute neighborhoods today.
And so what does that look like on a practical level? If I'm an urban planner and I'm trying to create more of that ideal within the 15-minute concept, how do I counterbalance that with providing enough incentive for people to leave their neighborhoods? Because as we all know, it's only when you actually head into a city center that you come across maybe an interesting mural that sparks an idea, or, so many things that you don't get to experience by remaining in your village.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the first thing we should do at the beginning is actually do more research in order to find more quantitative measures in order to describe a 15-minute city. So far, initially, at least, the 15-minute city, the 15-minute neighborhood was described in kind of a qualitative way. So the first thing is actually looking at this today using big data. We're actually doing that across all the United States, looking at to which extent different neighborhoods today work as 15-minute neighborhoods. And then with more data at hand, what we can do is actually start to think about how we can plan better district. And again, I think the goal should be to keep, yes, many of the frequent trips, daily trips inside the 15-minute radius, but at the same time, make sure that the richness that comes with living in a city is still there with all the other trips. Those are the trips when we, as you're saying, we go to the city center, we go to the opera, to the university, to the cinema, to a theater, to a special restaurant. And that's where we discover those things, again, that make a city a city.
Are there any examples of cities? You work all around the world. So have you seen any cities handle certain limitations, either unique to that city or perhaps more universal to a region or a broader area, that you can share of how they were able to apply a different solution to, if not come up with a strictly 15-minute city, something that at least adhered to similar principles?
Yeah, and first of all, we should say that cities have always been living with this concept. The neighborhood traditional neighborhoods were based on a 15-minute kind of approach. So again, it depends. Different cities have different, are based on different paths in terms of neighborhood planning. And so different cities start at different places. I think the good thing is that we're seeing a lot of experimentation, but let me tell you, some cities are, for instance, bringing more schools next to the neighborhood, so that again, kids can go to school much closer to where they are. Another thing is about having more flexible zoning. So flexible zoning allows, for instance, for things that are not in a sort of neighborhood to emerge, and for people to to open up some of the services that might be needed. And many others. And people are also looking at how to make walking and cycling more pleasant in each of the neighborhoods. So in that case, you might be looking at greening the city at a smaller scale, and then scale up at the entire urban organism, so to say. So I guess there's many experimentation. The good thing is a little bit like in the early 2000s, where people were trying many things in the space of digital, where today's digital and physical is rethinking the city. And this kind of rich innovation ecosystem is probably the best way to design and invent tomorrow's cities.
Okay. Thank you, Carlo.
Thanks a lot.
Let's turn now to Eric Iverson, who can speak about the challenges of adapting cities. Eric is a transportation expert and interim director of sustainability and resilience for the city of Tempe, Arizona, which adapted their urban environment into a 20-minute city. Welcome, Eric. Eric, I would love to understand some of the landscape and cityscape that makes Tempe. I think it sounds like such an interesting and dynamic place. Everything I've read about it suggests it's located in the desert, but it's got a city atmosphere. I know it's home to Arizona State University, and I also know that it's home to the largest office complex in the state, which is a beautiful complex of high rises. I don't think Tempe is a place that many people outside of America have heard about. So paint the picture for us.
Hey, thank you so much. It's a great question. We have a lot of pride about our community here in Tempe, Arizona. As you mentioned, we're a desert city. We're an arid city. We are about 40 square miles. And that's a pretty compact size in our region. We're in the middle of the Sonoran Desert in what is really kind of a sprawling suburban, most historically been established as a suburban region. However, Tempe, as you mentioned, we have a lot of redevelopment and density coming in. We have one of the largest universities in the country that is hometown in Tempe. We have the highest density in the state. We continue to go more vertical. We have highest per capita public transit ridership. We have highest by percent commute rates in the state. So we're really proud of some of those facts, but really because we are kind of more compact, because we have the highest density in the state, and we reached about 40 years ago, the limits of our city hit some of the other cities in this sprawling region. We became landlocked about 40 years ago, and that forced us as policymakers, as city planners, to make some really critical decisions about how we wanted to grow. And that led us then to some of the investments that we've made in public transportation, in our land use, that led to some of those facts and figures that I gave about our usage in the transportation system.
So if we compare the 20-minute city to the 15-minute city, because presumably the 20-minute city that you helped develop was based on the 15-minute city concept. What were the challenges that you faced? What were the challenges that were perhaps unique to Tempe? But also, I'm sure there are many other cities in the world that share some of the challenges, from heat. So, I mean, people aren't necessarily going to walk miles or even 1 mile in the heat of the summer in a place like the desert. If you could share some of the local and universal challenges, I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, so our 20-minute city really was a result of our 20-minute city effort is really the result of some of those conditions that I talked about earlier, where we're landlocked. We had to make our transportation system more efficient. We had to really look at how we built the city over 100 years. That was really around the car. We had to look at how do we improve that? How do we really build into the next 100 years a sustainable city and something that is accessible to everyone conveniently? We knew we had to grow differently. So the council, our city council, has over 100 performance measures that they have adopted in the last 7 years to guide our city on how we make investments and what our policies are. One of those that they selected was the 20-minute city effort. I'm not exactly sure why we picked 20 minutes over 15 minutes. When we did our initial research, we heard a lot about 20-minute cities. I've recently heard more about 15-minute cities. Maybe we picked 20 minutes as our metric because we have a tougher place to start from. We have a region and a city that was really built around the car. Separation of land uses, we have business over here, shopping over here, schools over here, housing over here. So we had some of those separation of uses in our land use, as well as more of a sprawling city built around the car. So maybe the 20-minute city seemed a little bit more approachable as a goal than 15 minutes. What we've done with that, our city council, we do annual check-ins on this measure to make sure they're aware of the progress that we're making on it. But really, the progress has to do with working with our community development department, our economic development department, and making sure that all of the growth that we have going forward in land use is reflective of us trying to be more mixed use with our development, more dense and vertical with our development. So we've adopted codes like our transportation-oriented development code that's in many parts of the city, but really follows some of our public transit routes and is encouraging development that faces transit, that integrates with transit, and gives people access to all different types of travel besides driving alone. So our land use, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Share some examples of how, because the way you've laid it out is that there are all these sort of satellite fragmented areas. How did you connect all of these areas to make it much more livable and synergistic and more appealing to people considering the area?
Yeah, so we, basically with the 20-minute city concept, what we're looking at is establishing essentially villages, little pockets or villages around our city. We're a big rectangle. Again, I said we're 40 square miles. So we have 9 character areas, which are essentially like our villages in the community. And we look at each one of those character areas as they're sort of equally distributed around the city. And we try to make sure that employment opportunity, housing opportunity, entertainment opportunities, that each one of those areas has all those things that you need to live your life within that kind of 20-minute city envelope. So we're not there yet. We obviously have a lot of work to do, but we are incorporating land use changes. We're developing codes in our land use that, like accessory dwelling units, really careful and selective infill, maybe of a parking lot where you can add residential. So really kind of surgically inserting into those village areas, those character areas, the missing pieces. And that varies with each of the different character areas. We have, for example, in our downtown, which is where I live, and it's where ASU is, Arizona State University, there was already a lot of amenities in that area. There was we have good public transit there. We have higher density there. A lot of those uses that you need to live your life we're already within that envelope of that 15-minute or 20-minute city. In the more suburban parts of our city, we have greater challenges. And so maybe a little bit more intense and careful attention to those areas. Interestingly, kind of getting to some of the challenges in those areas where we have less density and maybe a little bit, a lot less of those options for living your life that you need in a 20-minute city. We also have some pushback on changing the character of those areas, adding density, maybe adding some urban issues that come with that density, like graffiti or traffic. So we get some pushback there, and that's an educational process. That's a longer, really community dialogue process to get people to the place where they understand kind of the trade-offs that might come along with those land use changes that might support a better quality of life, but also might bring in some other challenges to them.
I want to ask you about this specific point that I referenced a bit earlier, the idea of encouraging more walking, because we're hearing so much about carless cities and the whole notion of encouraging residents to walk to places more or take scooters or bicycles. But again, if we look at the heat of a place like Arizona, I would imagine that presents a lot of limitations in terms of how much physical activity people are willing to do, especially on their way to or from work. How have you worked around or worked with this kind of challenge? I mean, have you encouraged employers or the new office complex at Marina Heights? Have you encouraged them to build showers, so that when people arrive at work, they can have a quick shower? What are some of the ways that you're dealing with a challenge such as that?
Yeah, I mean, heat is one of our major challenges. Now, the good thing with the heat, being in a dry climate, the good thing is we don't have to deal with, like some cities, they deal with snow or lots of rain. Those are challenges too for coming up with, good ways to move about your community. Walking and biking can become a little bit more challenging. With the heat, one of the things I like to say is that walking or biking, at least in our downtown area right now, is actually faster than getting in your car. Might take a while to cool down your car with your air conditioning. It's faster to walk or bike. It might be a little hot, but it can be faster than getting in your car, waiting for your car to cool down and getting to your destination. So that's one thing. That's a little anecdotal, kind of like how I live my life. But we have major tree planting initiatives. We have a council performance measure to look at tree planting citywide, improve that citywide. We look at a goal of 25% tree canopy coverage on all of our rights of way in our publicly owned lands. So our parks and our streets. And for perspective, generally we're under 5% tree canopy coverage on our streets. So having comfortable streets is a major priority for us. We're getting really good at having multimodal options on our street, having bike lanes, protected bike lanes, transit access, transit shelters. We've narrowed some streets to make them more balanced, taking away a lane of traffic to add some of those other modes that I'm talking about. But now we have to make them shadier. We have to make them more comfortable. So major initiatives to add trees and structural shade to our corridors, to our streets to make them more comfortable. I would say that's a big push for encouraging those modes that you're talking about, walking and biking, and getting folks out there doing those.
If we think about Marina Heights, this beautiful office complex, it seems a paradox to call an office complex beautiful, but the pictures are really impressive. That's a complex with high rises, the largest office complex in the state. How did you go about managing that kind of development while also trying to balance it with a sense of community and other lifestyle offerings?
That's a great question. We just completed, I'll use an example. We just completed a 3-mile rail extension in our downtown. And there was a lot of pushback to that. Some folks that were concerned that some of our oldest, most historic, most charming neighborhoods would be threatened by the push for higher density adjacent to that rail line. But I think one thing that we've gotten right in our city is that we have a lot of areas where we have vast parking lots that were, they're throwbacks to that era when we developed around the car, using those parking lots and using vacant land, as an area that was suburban for a long time. We have pieces of the city like Marina Heights that you're mentioning where it was vacant land. So we think we're hitting a sweet spot with our land use, where we are developing on those areas, those really opportune areas like a surface lot that people generally don't have a lot of emotional attachment to, and in those areas where we might have had an old golf course, it might have been an old landfill or vacant land, redeveloping, intensifying, and infilling carefully in those locations, while also protecting those most historic, most maybe vulnerable parts of our city. We've done both. We have a fantastic historic preservation program. We have dedicated staff, dedicated funding, and a community that's committed to that. And so we're doing both things of protecting those great, charming, historical parts of our community, and then carefully inserting some of that higher density. Even further, our general plan and some of our urban core initiatives, we work really closely with every development. Let's say it's a high rise adjacent to historic. We do things like we step down the building as it gets closer to that. It might be a full block that we're redeveloping, but on one side there might be a historic neighborhood. We step it down in the backside of that development, and then at maybe the arterial street facing, we would have that really intense, more higher density portion of the development, and then of course with ground level retail or office or city services. So down to really granular level treatment of each individual project that comes forward, and then also larger city policies that protect our historic neighborhoods and historic structures, and then taking the opportunity for some of those places that are like parking lots and vacant land and really intensifying that land use. Some of it's just been luck, the way the city developed over 75 years, but I think, I think we're hitting a really sweet spot on both redeveloping nicely and adding that density, and then carefully protecting our historic character neighborhoods.
I just want to ask you one more question, which is what lessons or perhaps triumphs have you experienced in this redevelopment process to create a 20-minute city? Can you share with other people who may be working on urban planning and development projects in their own cities?
Wow. Well, um, I mean, so I've been in this city for 32 years. I came here to go to ASU for school, and I've been working for the city of Tempe for 26 years. Um, and the thing that I say the most about affecting change is just show up every day and believe in a North Star and keep steering towards that. There's a lot of defeats that you have along the way. But if you show up every day, and you're again, you have a trajectory that you're working towards, I think you get there eventually. Education's a big part of it. People just knowing the benefits of moving and, moving towards a certain objective makes a big difference. We spend a lot of time, this is advice I would give to folks, we spend a lot of time in our city having community dialogues. So sometimes it can be a tough process and tough conversations, but as a landlocked city, we have a finite, we have finite land and finite resources. How do we best utilize every space, every corner that we have in our city? And how do people want to live their lives going forward? People generally can accept some of the trade-offs, like maybe they drove their car for 40 years, but they can see that if we adapt, we build a city where there's more goods and services near them that might add density, might add some urbanism to their neighborhood, but then they can see that there is the ability to live their life differently, maybe a little bit healthier, that they can then support that. And so we have projects that we've spent 10 years on to get it done. And it was just a long community dialogue about the pros and cons of that. And it's a journey. And so I would say our council's committed to that. The community generally has been committed to that. And that's I would say a really effective way of making change. And it's incremental.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you for joining us.